Hello everyone, it's Will back, and we're really making progress with this. So we're up to mid-February, and in fact today going from the 10th to the 14th. Dmitri has skipped the 13th. So we're covering a lot of ground, although they're mostly short diary entries. So is there anything that needs to be said in advance? So just to recap what happened yesterday, there was trouble between Dmitri and George Mikhailovich. George Mikhailovich had asked Dmitri a question of some kind, and Dmitri had shown that, if not actually saying, had shown that that question annoyed, and I think he actually did say it annoyed him and that he thought it was stupid. And that had precipitated this whole problem. And then he had complained to Laimings' wife, Maria Nikolaevna. He had said something nasty to her about her husband. Nasty is the word he uses. And it had upset her so much that she didn't even want to participate in that evening in their evening reading, and she was the one who was doing the reading, and her husband had to persuade her that she should go ahead with it, so she did. So he seemed to have been less upset by this whole incident, but maybe not, because this time around things get even more tense. All right, so we'll start with the diary entry of 10th February 1906. This is a troubled time for me. GM is constantly scolding and upbraiding me. Naturally, that doesn't make me angry, but there is one thing that does. The fact that he doesn't reprimand me personally, but instead does it through Maria. Is it pleasant for me to have another person find out about my sins? I don't care about the scolding itself. Of course it's unpleasant, but I want to emphasize that I'm not angry. I can't be angry. But when GM speaks not to me, but Maria, I can't help myself. I make a sour face, and GM thinks I'm offended when he scolds me, but it's only that one thing, only that. And I couldn't tell him how I felt about it because he wouldn't speak to me, and I didn't want to start the conversation. We had lunch and dinner at that palace and tea at home, after which we skated upstairs, and after skating we read Torrents of Spring. Very interesting. I finally got bored of Sherlock, or I have finally gotten bored of Sherlock, I should say. This is me. All the stories were the same, and that was Dmitri. And I couldn't agree with him more. You read a couple Sherlock Holmes stories and they're interesting, but then they quickly become all the same, in my opinion, and with apologies to anyone who's a big Sherlock Holmes fan. So he ends it, sorry, I forgot to add that he ends it with the time, 10:30. So he was up a bit late writing his diaries and didn't finish until 10:30. All right, this troubled time. As I say, things have now spread from Maria Nikolaevna to George Mikhailovich himself. So now both the Laimings, and George has started scolding and upbraiding Dmitri. Dmitri perceives it as relentless and probably feels like he can't do anything right. Of course, we don't have George Mikhailovich's side of the story, but he emphasizes that he is not angry, and he even says in the next paragraph, I can't be angry. And my inclination to think that being angry and losing his temper had been a real problem for me. So my PhD supervisor, Lindsay Hughes, had always emphasized to me that if you're reading legal documents, if you're reading laws, if you're reading diary entries or what have you, and people mention something in this way and do it repeatedly, that it usually means that this was a real problem. So an example would be recently in my Schatzalp posts, there was an instance where in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, they were telling people, there was a notice that it was forbidden to use the bobsled run with just anything you wanted to sit on and go down the hill on, and without permission to do so. So the fact that this was in the newspaper indicated that it had probably been a problem for quite a while. Before they finally take steps to put something like that in a newspaper, it usually has been an ongoing problem. So for me, when I'm into those, for me personally, I find it problematic that people mountain bike down the hiking path, because the hiking path is narrow and sometimes it's very heavily trafficked by pedestrians and even brave souls who push strollers up with babies in them, and mountain bikers will come barreling down, and it's a big problem. And it's an ongoing problem. So one of these days, I'm sure there's going to end up being a notice somewhere saying do not do this, but by the time that happens, it will clearly have been something that's been going on for a long time. So that is a long-winded way of saying that I think Dmitri was probably had probably gotten in trouble for, and was now probably trying to not get angry and not lose his temper, and that is why he takes pains to emphasize in this diary entry that it doesn't make me angry and I can't be angry, in his words. But what does upset him very much, even if he's not losing his temper, he's making faces, he's not losing his temper, but what does upset him very much is that George Mikhailovich is now not only scolding him directly, but telling Maria about the bad things that he's done, his sins, as he puts it. And that he finds extremely upsetting, and I would have as well at that age. My God, if my mother or father, instead of just talking to me, had gone and talked to my sister, whether in my presence or not, about the things that they were upset about with me, yes, that would have made me angry. And in fact, my sister is 18 months older than me, so the same age difference between Dmitri and Maria. So when I was 14, she was 16, like Maria, and boy, would that have ignored the heck out of me, and I probably would have lost my temper. So I'm assuming I should add that he's talking about his sister, Maria, and not about Laimings' wife, Maria, because he never refers to her as Maria or Laiming as George. He always says GM and MN, which means when he was addressing them in person, he was using the formal Russian the formal Russian form of address, which is to use a person's first name and patronymic instead of their last name. You're not going to say Mr. So-and-so, you're going to say Ivan Nikolaevich, and that's the polite way of saying it. So even though they are apparently using Dmitri's first name and just calling him Dmitri instead of Dmitri Pavlovich, he is calling them Georgy Mikhailovich and Maria Nikolaevna and Miss June. I'm not sure what her patronymic was, but they're either using a title in the case of Monsieur Welter and Miss June, or they're using the first name and patronymic, which he's simply abbreviating in his diaries, and it would have been absolutely disrespectful to use just the first name, and even more disrespectful to have just called George Mikhailovich Laiming, because that was how you addressed servants and not someone who was a respected member of the household or a friend. Okay, so this situation now has gotten so bad that George Mikhailovich is not even speaking to him. Maybe he made one face too many while George Mikhailovich was talking to him, and now George Mikhailovich is not even speaking to him. And so you have this awkward situation where Dmitri, being 14 years old and feeling misused in this instance, does not want to be the first one to talk. And so he can't tell George Mikhailovich how he feels about George Mikhailovich talking to Maria. So that's not a good situation. And I have to say, I think Dmitri was probably completely in the wrong, but I think it wasn't, I don't think it was exactly mature for George Mikhailovich then to give him the silent treatment. I don't think that helped things. Okay, let's see. They went skating again. They had lunch at the palace, but they didn't have tea there. They had tea at home, and if you've been following these diary entries all along, you'll remember that Alexandra had told Dmitri that it was inconvenient for her and Uncle Nicky to have Maria and Dmitri there for tea. Maybe that was their family time with their own children, or their husband and wife time just to relax together. I don't know, but I haven't been keeping track. I should go back and look and see how many times subsequently Dmitri and Maria did go to that palace for tea instead of for lunch. Okay, maybe some of you remember. So the last thing in this diary entry that I find very interesting is that they're reading Torrents of Spring, Vieshnia Vody, and it is a novel by Ivan Turgenev. And as you'll see as the diary entries continue, a lot of what they're reading together in the evening is are works by Turgenev. So Turgenev had been dead for, I think, about 13 years. He had written this particular book. It was a novella in 1872, so about 11 years after the end of serfdom. And he was considered a major Russian writer, one of the big ones, right up there with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, although, he still is to a certain extent. But if you ask an educated American who were the giants of Russian literature, they would certainly know Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but maybe not Turgenev. So what interests me about this 16-year-old and 14-year-old being read this book is that Turgenev was not someone who would have seen eye to eye necessarily with the imperial family. He was a member of the nobility, but probably his most famous book was called Fathers and Sons, Otci and Dieti. So it's usually translated Fathers and Sons instead of Fathers and Children, which is the literal Russian translation. And in it, there's a man who's a nihilist, a famous character named Bazarov, who represents the new generation and the nihilism or nihilism of the new generation. And he's the protagonist of the book. And things don't end well for him, but he is presented as a noble character, and it emphasizes the generation gap as it existed at that time in more or less the 1860s and early 70s in Russia. And interestingly, then in America, a century later, the 1960s and 1970s. So it's interesting, and I think it's to the Laimings' credit that they were choosing books by Turgenev. He also wrote. I'm not a big fan of Turgenev. I find his writing a bit clumsy, whether in Russian or English. There were some Russian authors who ranked him even above Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. But personally, I'm not a big fan, and some writers from elsewhere in Europe who liked him better as well. My favorite book by him is called Notes from a Hunter's Album, and I highly recommend it. It's a brilliant book. And again, it has content that the most conservative element would not have been happy with, because it's about the years before the ending of serfdom. Turgenev was a passionate hunter, and so it's really about him himself being out on country in forests and stopping by various country estates and inns and having encounters with the simple people, the peasants, and hearing their stories, which are sometimes just absolutely blood-curdlingly horrific. And so even though this, so he was emphasizing the mistreatment and the painful ignorance that the peasants had been left to endure. And so, I would say good for Laiming for choosing these books, but the fact of the matter is that so far he has not chosen those particular works of Turgenev's. In this diary entry, or in the diary entry to come, the Turgenev works that the children are reading are not these ones that have a political point to make. So maybe later. I mean, Dmitri, for one, was still a bit young. And apparently George Mikhailovich did not let him read War and Peace, so maybe he was considered a bit young yet for these books. So an interesting thing that I didn't realize, but when I was doing a little reading about Turgenev today, I saw that he had actually written a short story that the title of which was the same racial slur that Dmitri used when he was out with his cousins, the Konstantinovich boys, and made fun of his 19-year-old cousin for not knowing what that word meant. So if you want to know what that word is, you can look up the Turgenev's collective works and come across that title. But I suppose Dmitri, maybe they read that short story, so maybe that's where he learned the word. All right, so let us go on to diary entry 11 of the 11th. I am terribly upset. Maria Nikolaevna was all in tears, and both of them, i.e. GM and MN, left for Petersburg, St. Petersburg, a terrible scandal. Tomorrow there will be a cinematograph for wounded soldiers in the big arena. Lots of fun. Today we rode in a sleigh with little sleds tied behind the big one. We had great fun this afternoon. 10:30, so he's going to bed late again. So boy, have things escalated now. Things have gotten so bad that the Laimings have just packed their bags and left. And of course they'll be coming back, but they, I guess, are showing how angry they are by saying, well, we need a break from this kid, so we're going to go for a day or two to St. Petersburg. A terrible scandal, indeed, as Dmitri himself puts it. And maybe he did lose his temper between the 10th and the 11th, because on the 10th, George Mikhailovich was simply not speaking to him, and on the 11th, all of a sudden, the Laimings are leaving. And he doesn't say who is then in charge of Dmitri and Maria, but Dmitri is going straight from that topic to what he's doing that he enjoys. Tomorrow there will be a movie for wounded soldiers in the big arena, so I'm thinking it was probably a riding arena. And as I mentioned before, the soldiers were people who had been wounded in the Russo-Japanese War and who were recovering from that and who were still in need of hospitalization and medical care. And then he talks about the sleigh riding and the sledding, and so he's just jumping from the one upsetting topic to to one that's less upsetting, and maybe that was good because he was about to go to bed, and so he could think about something pleasant. So I have really gone too long this time, and so I'm not going to get to the 12th and the 14th. Even though they're very short, and we're coming up on some really big ones, bigger than we've had before. I guess the last thing I wanted to say before I forget is that Dmitri does seem to have had, last time we talked about this word he used that's not obscene in itself, but that is obscene in certain context, and he used it and badly offended a woman or a girl in Moscow. And he and his sister, how sheltered were they? They'd been kept very sheltered in Moscow. But he seems to have been exposed to language that the children of Grand Duke Constantine, for instance, even in their late teens, had not been exposed to. So what was going on with that? Was he were certain members of the staff talking to him in ways they shouldn't have? I don't know. That's hard to say, I don't know where that came from. I don't think it came from Uncle Nicky or Uncle Sergei or anybody like that. So something to keep an eye on. He was a little more sophisticated in his knowledge of things in some ways, not in every way. And we have some interesting diary entries coming up in that respect, but he liked to be a little provocative in his language, and maybe he was showing off that he did know these things, that he was more in on the joke than his older cousin. So anyway, we'll return to that later. I'm getting more and more long-winded. I've actually gone 22 minutes, so sorry about that, but come back next time anyway. Bye.